Hello, I'm Mr. Perez with the Illustration Department, and tonight I'm going to be demoing how to use the mat cutters in the Digital Checkout Studio. Before I get started, I'm going to mention a couple of things about safety. The mat cutters in the studio use very sharp blades. These things are razor sharp, and they will cut you and anything they come into contact with. So please be real careful. Okay? Make sure and know where the blades are at all time. Don't lay the blades down, forget that it's there, and then come back a little while later and just drag your arm across it. You can cut yourself. Also, don't throw these in the trash. They're very, very easy to just think, okay, I'm just going to toss it in the trash, no problem. Somebody else comes later on to take the trash can out, clean it up. They cut themselves with a blade. All right, so we're going to put the blade aside for right now. Everything else about this mat cutter is pretty safe. You might pinch your fingers. Other than that, you should be good to go. The next important thing when dealing with these mat cutters is deciding what to cut on the mat cutter. There's mat board, which is what mostly you're going to be using when you come into the studio. There's also mount board and foam core that's very thick. It's very heavy. This is an inappropriate use for this cutter. Unfortunately, there's some score marks on this table from using this kind of board. This is too thick. It changes the angle. If I slide this in under the cutter head, it changes the angle of the cutter head. That blade will dig into the table and destroy the surface. So please don't use this kind of board on this machine. That applies to foam core as well. No cutting of foam core on this machine. You can use single or double thickness mat board as long as it's just that, mat board. You can also cut illustration board with it or any board that's thin. The first step in cutting a mat is deciding what size, what dimensions the ultimate mat is going to be. Ultimately, you need to start out with an extra board around your artwork. There needs to be a little bit of space all the way around. I should be able to grab the artwork without touching it. So when you're doing a print, leave a little extra bit of paper or the mat won't have anything to grab to. Okay, the first real serious part about cutting this mat is really getting down into the nuts and bolts of measuring and making sure that all of your measurements are correct, being really, really accurate. Measure twice, cut once. And for most artists, measure 5 times, cut once. I'm one of those people. I'm going to come in and measure my artwork. It's 8 inches wide. If you're a person like me that requires I need to write stuff down. I can't just rely on what I'm seeing here and what goes into my head. So I'm going to go ahead and write this down on the back of my mat board. That way it's handy. At all times I know where my measurements are. So that's 8 inches wide by 6 1/4 tall. Okay, next step is deciding how wide you want your board to be, how much mat is going to show. Biggest problem I see with the senior show is mats that you get that 1 little inch. The mat border is about as thick as this ruler. You don't want something that thin. I would say minimum is about 2 inches, preferably 3, maybe 4 inches, depending on the size of the piece. A piece about this big, 2 to 3 inches is probably ideal. Okay, so now I need to do a little bit of math. I know that's a tough part, but work with me here. Okay, we've got 8 inches by 6 1/4. We need to add, I'm going to go ahead and go with 3. We're going to add 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, and then 3 1/4 at the bottom. A mat should always be bottom heavy. To balance out, there should be a slightly wider strip along the bottom. Before I do that though, I have 8 by 6 1/4. That's the exact dimensions of the piece of work. If I cut my window exactly the right size, it might not line up perfectly. So what I'm going to wind up doing is subtract 1/4 inch from both dimensions. That way the mat will overlap the piece of work by 1/8 inch all the way around. So that ends up being 7 3/4 by 6. Measure twice, cut once. I'm going to verify, just to be sure. 6 inches, that works. 7 3/4, that works. Okay, so now I know that's my final art dimensions. I scratched through that top number so I don't forget which number I'm using. Now I need to add the 3-inch border all the way around. So I'm going to add 6 inches. Remember, at 6 inches, if you only add 3, you're going to be cutting an entire new board again. It's 3 inches here, the dimension of your board, and then 3. So that's 13 3/4. I'm going to add 3 up top and 3 1/4 at the bottom, so I'm adding 6 1/4 to that vertical dimension. By 12 1/4. So 13 3/4 by 12 1/4. That's the ultimate size of this board, which I've already pre-cut just to speed things along a little bit. I'm using a gray mat board for this demo so that you can clearly see the bevel once I cut it. If you're using a gray mat board, you want to make sure that your teacher or whoever you're cutting it for has approved a different color other than black or white. Once again, check with your instructor and see how that goes. Okay, now that I know the size of my board, it's already cut down, I need to draw the guidelines where I'm going to actually cut with the mat cutter on the back of this board. I determined that it's going to be 3 inches, and what I'll normally do to keep myself from getting messed up is I'll write down 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 1/4. The more visual cues I give myself, the less likely I am to mess up. I'm going to pull my ruler out again. I'm going to find my 3-inch mark. I'm going to give myself a little tick mark. I'm going to do the same on the other side. Be very precise. The closer you measure, the more accurate, the nicer your mat's going to look. You want to connect those lines, go all the way to the edge of the board. You don't want to stop short, because you could end up with a mat, you don't know exactly where to stop your cut. I'm going to go to 3 and a 3. Draw another line. I usually like to do all my equal sides first. So I don't get lost and wind up putting the wrong measurement in the wrong spot. And the last one is 3 1/4. Remember, always add a slightly thicker strip at the bottom of the mat. And there I started making a mistake right there, just caught myself. 3 1/4 and 3 1/4. Okay, now the back of your board should look like this. Nice, clean, neat lines. If you make a mistake, erase it fully. Get rid of all the pencil marks. If you have 500 lines on the back of your board, you're going to end up with a mess that you won't be able to tell exactly where to start and stop your cuts. Okay, now the next part is cutting with the machine. It's probably a good idea to set your blade aside or your board aside at this point so you don't actually damage it or get fingerprints on it. By the way, if you want to use cotton gloves during this process to eliminate fingerprints, it's probably a good idea. Okay, setting up the mat cutter involves, for most people, getting rid of or sliding this arm out of the way. There's 2 knobs. Big knob and a teeny tiny little knob on this end. Unscrew those knobs just to the point where they're a little bit loose and slide this arm back out of the way if you're not going to be using it. Please don't remove this from the cutter. I keep finding this arm everywhere all over this room, and it really creates a bit of a problem if you do want to use it. It's also, unfortunately, from all the removing, taking off and putting it back on, we've lost one of the knobs and the arm is getting slowly knocked out of whack. So I recommend just set it out of the way and tighten the knobs. Leave it attached to the machine, please. The next step, to remove the blade cartridge, there's a knob at the front of the cutter head. Undo that knob, it unscrews to the left. And then there's a little tiny knob on the back of the cutter. Little tiny knob right there. You want to grab that knob and pull the cartridge out. Notice there's no blade in there. If you use this machine correctly, you should dispose of the blade when you're done with it. Don't leave a blade in there so that the next person will accidentally get cut. Okay, now we're going back to the cutter the blade that I originally mentioned. It slides into the end of the cutter head. It's a tight fit. Please be careful not to cut yourself. Slide the blade in. If there's any resistance at all, pull it back out and keep going. It can be a little tricky at times, so just make sure you're getting the blade in the right spot. Push the blade all the way in. You don't want the blade sticking part way out. You don't want any part of the blade getting out of control on you. Make sure it's all the way in. Don't adjust this tiny little knob. This tiny little knob controls how far the blade goes in and out. It's set right now for a typical mat board use. If you need to cut something thicker, you can adjust this knob, but for the most part, just leave it alone. Reinsert the cartridge in the cutter head and tighten the knob, the large knob with the little knurled bumps on it. Once that's nice and tight, you're ready to go. The Fletcher mat cutter in this studio is a professional mat cutter that you'd find in most frame shops. So you can really get a high quality mat by using this equipment. Now keep in mind this equipment it's professional quality, but it requires a little bit of practice to master it. I cut mats for a number of years, so don't expect to maybe get the results the first time you use it. Grab a scrap board, this nice ugly bright blue board that you don't want to use on your artwork, by the way, for most of the time. I'm going to go ahead and just chop this up a little bit, do a few practice swipes, just so you get an idea of what you need to do and what you shouldn't do, what you should avoid. All right, using the mat cutter is pretty simple. You lift this arm and you slide your board in. If you're using the measurement arm, you can undo these knobs, slide the arm up. I'm going to go ahead and set it at 3 inches. Just to give myself an idea of how wide my cutter should be. Using this cutter head is all about making sure that the cutter head stays stationary when you start your cut. If you just push straight down, the mat cutter tends to roll forward. When you do that, the blade will punch. When it punches, there's a tiny little spot right there. It's really hard to see on camera, I'd imagine, but there's a little burr or a nub that forms when you punch through. You want a nice clean cut. Notice how the second cut I did doesn't show on the surface. That's a nice smooth cut. To get that kind of cut started, you want to pivot straight back. Almost start rolling the cutter head back as you pivot down. So it's cut into the board and start rolling back a little bit. When I flip the board over, there's a little bit of a burr, but it's way smaller than the larger burr I cut earlier. That's a manageable one. That's not that big of a deal. Ultimately, your goal is to get a perfectly clean, smooth cut. The only way to do that is to practice. Do that numerous times until you can get it almost exactly perfect. Notice the perfect cut that time. I nailed it. If you're not getting enough of a cut, it's not going all the way through, or it's creating too much of a burr, you can always remove the cutter head and adjust the blade out a little further. If you turn this tiny adjustment screw on the back of the cartridge clockwise, the blade will come out further and you'll be able to get a slightly deeper cut, which sometimes will alleviate the problem. I'm going to go ahead and switch blades just to make sure I have a fresh blade. Any tests that you do, change the blade out between cuts. I know it seems wasteful, but a sharp blade will keep you from destroying a $20 piece of board that would otherwise live to see another day if you use a clean blade. Okay, actually cutting the mat. This is the mat that I marked up earlier. Remember, one dimension is a little bit larger, so I can't use the measurement ruler built into the machine. So I'm going to move that out of the way. secure it in place, and then go back to my board. To start your cut, you want to lift the cutter arm up, slide the mat board in place, and line it up carefully with the pencil line that you did earlier. Getting an accurate cut involves knowing exactly where to start your cut. You usually want to start your cut about 1/8 of an inch beyond the line that you drew with the pencil. About 1/8 of an inch or so beyond that. So I'm going to find my line, and I'm going to go about 1/8 of an inch beyond it. I'm going to hold down, put some weight down on the arm, and make my cut. Stopping the cut is the same. You have to go about 1/8 of an inch past your stop line. Knowing how far the blade is back in the cutter head is a bit confusing, so the manufacturer put a notch. There's a little notch on the head. That notch is really important. That tells you where the blade is. So that little line should end up 1/8 of an inch past your pencil line. Rotate your mat. I recommend that you rotate clockwise. That way your next cut is starting past the cut that I just made. I'm going to go past the line about 1/8 of an inch and end about 1/8 of an inch past. Once again, I'm using that tiny little mark, which is almost impossible to see in this light. And I'm going to repeat. I'm going to deliberately shortcut this one. I'm going to undercut so that the piece of board doesn't necessarily fall out. I'll show you how to deal with a potential problem when it comes up. Hopefully the board won't pop out. The natural inclination when you finish all 4 cuts is to pull this board out and just yank it out. Be careful. I recommend that you support the piece that's supposed to drop out in case one of the corners is hanging up. If you have a corner that's hanging up, lay your board down carefully. And this is a little trick I learned from doing this professionally for a number of years when I was in college. You want to slide your blade in between the two pieces of board, right in that bevel. If you try and kind of manhandle the bevel, it's not going to work. You want to let go. Hopefully the board won't slide away. You want to let go, and the blade will find its own angle. Automatically, the blade is in the right spot. It's at the right angle. I don't have to do anything else now besides go into the corner and just pop the little piece of board free. With any luck, that's what happens. You have a nice clean cut. The next job is to inspect your handiwork. Flip it over. Do you have nasty overcuts? If you have nasty overcuts, you can always use, if you kind of burnish the cuts down with the tip of your nail, you can really eliminate tiny little overcuts from showing. If you have a giant, like 1/2 inch overcut, throw the board, start over again. It's just not going to work. Notice I chose the gray board because you can see that white bevel. That white bevel should be facing out. You should see a white bevel from the front. If you don't see a white bevel from the front, you had your mat board on the wrong side. When you're cutting your piece, always remember your mat, the bulk of your mat stays to the right of the cutter head. If the mat is on this side, the bevel's not going to show. And what's the point of cutting a nice professional mat if the bevel doesn't show? Assuming that everything looks good, all of your cuts are nice and smooth, there's no overcuts, you can proceed by attaching your artwork. If you have a problem at this point, remember you can always take the blade and just cut away any little burrs. Fortunately, I was able to get a pretty clean cut. I have a little bit of an overcut on this side that's not the greatest in the world, but I can probably live with it. I think most people will be okay with this mat. The last step in assembling your piece is to attach your artwork to your mat. I recommend using, for most purposes, artist tape will work on something that's thin, lightweight like this. If you're doing something that's foam core or a heavier board, if your artwork is on a heavy piece of illustration board, you might want to consider a heavier type of tape. The standard artist tape doesn't have enough grip, there's not enough tack. So you might want to switch to clear packing tape or something like that. Don't use duct tape, please. Please do not use duct tape. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go with, I think I'm going to use the white artist tape. I'm going to grab a nice long piece and I'm going to lay it face up on the table. I might look like a cat with tape on my paw here in a second if it gets stuck. There we go. All right, I'm going to take the piece of artwork and lay it on top. Face up. Sticky side up. Now I'm going to grab my mat. It's important to remember which side is the thicker one. Remember the back where I put the little numbers on there? I don't have to guess. I don't have to measure. I know that's my 3 1/4. So I'm going to lay that down over my piece of artwork. Now remember, this is going to crop into your artwork a little bit. So I recommend that you paint a bleed or leave a little bit of extra work that you're not really concerned with losing, because the mat is covering up about 1/8 of an inch of my work. Or actually somebody else's work. This is a media student from a few years ago. Now I have a piece of artwork that's attached. I can grab a blade. It can be a mat cutter blade. Be careful with these blades if you're using them freehand. You can use an X-Acto, any method for removing the excess tape. Keep track of these, which actually a good use for this tape I found, if you're concerned with getting cut, is lay some tape down over the blade, over the bevel, and now you won't cut yourself. That's all she wrote. You don't need to tape this down. Your artwork is attached to the mat correctly. If you tape this all the way around and we get an afternoon thunderstorm, in about a day or two, your artwork is going to look wavy and ripply. Right now, the paper can expand without any issues. I lay it down on my board and I'm good to go. Which brings me to a backer board. When you stick this in a frame, you're going to have some kind of backer board in place so that your paper sits nice and smooth in your mat. If you want, you can use double-sided or double stick tape on the back of the board to attach the board firmly to this board, but that's really not necessary. If you slide these two into a frame, you should be good to go. It'll stay nice and solid, your artwork will remain flat, there'll be no ripples, no issues, and it'll look really good when you're all done. When you're finished with your mat cutter blades, always remember to properly dispose of them. They go in the recycling bin next to the vertical cutter. Just drop your blades in and you're good to go.